Okay, so let's start with chapter 8 now. And I think you're starting to get a sense that things are going to move quickly here, right? And if that is your sense, then you are absolutely correct. When I was talking to you at the beginning of the chapter 7 lecture about character arc, right? Now we kind of start to see Dorian change. Not only that, but we see him kind of also regret what he did. At the beginning of chapter 8, Dorian Gray is full of regret for the way that he treated Sybil Vane. He wakes up, he writes her this letter, and before he writes that letter, he wants to make sure he's not losing his mind a bit. He wants to make sure that the painting actually is changing and everything that he thinks is happening with the painting is happening. So he goes up and it says, if the thing was true, it was terrible. If it was not true, why trouble about it? But what if by some fate or deadlier chance, eyes other than his spied behind and saw the horrible change? What should he do if Basil Hallward came and asked to look at his own picture? Basil would be sure to do that. No, the thing had to be examined. And at once, anything would be better than this dreadful state of doubt. Okay, so he wakes up. Remember, he puts the screen in front of the portrait, and now he's like, could it be? Could it really be that this thing is changing? And he's like, and it's not just like me, like, it's not just about me wanting to look at it, but what if Basil wants to come and view it? Or what if he decides that he wants to go show it in a gallery? And now it's like this, got this weird smirk on it. And Basil, as the painter, would for sure know that that's not what he painted. So he looks at it. He got up, locked the doors. It was perfectly true. The portrait had altered. So he's using this word that's saying that the portrait had altered. The portrait has changed. So it made him conscious of how unjust, how cruel he had been to Sybil Vane. It was not too late for him to make reparation for that. So he says again at the top of this, well, it's my top of my page 100, but at the top of this chapter, but here was a visible symbol, again, that phrase, visible symbol, visible emblem of the degradation of sin, right? Here was an ever-present sign of the ruin men brought upon their souls. So what Oscar Wilde is kind of introducing to us is this very kind of like surreal idea, and it reminds me of what's the kind of genre of Latin American novel that I'm thinking of, and I can't think of it right now, but if I remember, I'm going to mention it. But this surreal idea where, what if we had a portrait? Like, what if I had a portrait in my home somewhere, and it was actually what my soul looked like? And my soul, right? Who knows? If would it be me just marred and ugly? Like, how would we look at ourselves? What would we think about ourselves? Would it change how we act? Would it change the choices that I make in my life? Because some of us walk around saying, I don't have a soul. I don't believe in the soul. Others are very worried about their soul. And so Wilde is kind of introducing the idea, yeah, what if you had a painting of your soul? And the way that he talks about sin bringing ruin to men's souls. So he's kind of introducing now the idea of sin being real. There is a difference between good and evil, and it does make a mark on us forever. Finally, he went over the table. I read that section last time where he writes this letter, he writes this letter, he writes this letter. Harry shows up at his door, kind of frantic, okay? And he says, oh, Dorian, I'm so glad, you know, oh no, here, I'm in front of, I feel sure you had, did you make a scene? I was brutal, Harry, perfectly brutal, but it's all right now. I'm not sorry for anything that has happened. It has taught me to know myself better. Dorian, I'm so glad you take it that way. I was afraid I would find you plunged in remorse and tearing that nice curly hair of yours. So Henry's only concern is like, Dorian, you didn't do anything terrible to yourself and hurt your pretty face. I've gotten through all that. He said, don't sneer at it, Harry, anymore, at least not before me. I want to be good. I can't bear the idea of my soul being hideous. Now, again, pointing back to the idea of beauty versus ugly. Excuse me a bit. He doesn't like his soul being ugly. So at first he's obsessed with the outside and being beautiful. But now he's like, I want my insides to be beautiful too. Okay, that's it. That's a valid desire, right? That's something, it's not a bad thing to want. A very charming artistic basic for ethics, Dorian, Harry replies, right? I congratulate you, but how are you going to begin? Dorian says, by marrying Sybil Vane. Marrying Sybil Vane, cried Lord Henry, standing up and looking at him in complete perplexed amazement. But my dear Dorian. Yes, Harry, I know what you're going to say. Something dreadful about marriage. Don't say it. Don't ever say anything. 2 days ago, I asked Sybil to marry me. I'm not going to break my word to her. She is to be my wife. Your wife, Dorian, did you get my letter? I wrote to you this morning and sent the note down by my own man. Your letter? Oh, yes, I remember. I've not read it yet. You know nothing then, Harry says to him. What do you mean, Dorian? Lord Henry walked across the room and, sitting down by Dorian Gray, took both hands in his own and held them tightly. Dorian, he said, my letter, don't be afraid, was to tell you that Sybil Vane is dead. A cry of pain broke from the lad's lips, and he leaped to his feet, tearing his hands away from Lord Henry's grasp. Dead? Sybil dead? It is not true. It's a horrible lie. How dare you say it? Now, this was foreshadowed, okay? Now, it wasn't foreshadowed by her... Well, okay, I'm going to take that back. It was foreshadowed by the way she reacted to Dorian, in that the last image we have of Sybil Vane in the book is her lying on the ground. So that's a telling image. The second way it was foreshadowed at the end of chapter 7 is that when he repeats her name over and over in the garden, Wilde writes, the birds that were singing in the dew-drenched garden seemed to be telling the flowers about her. Now, birds in poetry and in literature oftentimes symbolize messengers. Now, why would the birds be messaging to the flowers about Sybil Vane? Because she had passed to the other side, because she was in fact dead. So those were two foreshadowing details that we could have had as readers to say, wait a minute, not surprising, kind of led up to that, right? And of course she was devastated, so not surprising either. I mean, he was quite harsh to her. It's quite true, Dorian. It is in all the morning papers. I wrote you to ask you, and it says that she's 17. And then Dorian Gray says, so I have murdered Sybil Vane, murdered her as surely as if I had cut her little throat with a knife. And then, now we see Dorian fall in love with Sybil Vane, ask her to marry him. We see him change his mind drastically. He tells her she's nothing to him. She doesn't even inspire his curiosity anymore. And that she's worthless. Then we see him see the picture change and change his mind. I'm going to go back to Sybil Vane. I'm going to marry her. And now, listen to this when he finds out that she has passed away. Yet the roses are not less lovely for all that. The birds sing just as happily in my garden, and tonight I am to dine with you and then go on to the opera and sup somewhere, I suppose, afterward. How extraordinarily dramatic life is. If I had read all this in a book, Harry, I think I would have wept over it. Somehow, now that it has happened actually and to me, it seems far too wonderful for tears. Here's the first passionate love letter I have ever written in my life. Strange that my first passionate love letter should have been addressed to a dead girl. Can they feel, I wonder, those white silent people we call the dead? Sybil, can she feel or know or listen? Oh, Harry, how I loved her once. It seems years ago to me now. She was everything to me. Then came that dreadful night. Was it really only last night? When she played so badly and my heart almost broke? She explained it all to me. It was terribly pathetic, but I was not moved a bit. I thought her shallow. Suddenly something happened that made me afraid. I can't tell you what it was, but it was terrible. I said I would go back to her. I felt I had done wrong, and now she's dead. My God. My God, Harry, what shall I do? You don't know the danger I'm in, and there's nothing to keep me straight. She would have done that for me. She had no right to kill herself. It was selfish of her. Have you ever seen a character like Dorian Gray? Maybe like a 14-year-old, right? So Sybil Vane is 17. Dorian, we know, is coming into his money, so he's probably like 20 at this point. My dear Dorian, Lord Henry says. And now, what kind of consolation do you think Henry's going to give to Dorian, knowing the kind of character that Lord Henry is, right? Harry, cried Dorian Gray, coming over and sitting down beside him, why is it that I cannot feel this tragedy as much as I want to? I don't think I am heartless. Do you? You have done too many foolish things during the last fortnight to be entitled to give yourself that name, Dorian, answered Lord Henry with a sweet, melancholy smile. And then Henry goes into a long speech, and I think you're now familiar with these long diatribes that Lord Henry gives on his ideas about marriage and about women and about beauty and about genius. And now he's going to talk to us about romance. And what he says is just, it just gives me the chills kind of, and like a little bit of tingles because it's kind of wild. Someone has killed herself for you. I wish that I ever had such an experience. It would have made me in love with love for the rest of my life. And that is how he thinks of it. Dorian, you should appreciate this moment that has shown you what love truly is, that it's as dramatic as those plays that we love to watch. It is as high and low as the operas that we like to go see. And talks about women some more, never trust a woman. And then Lord Henry says, there is something to me quite beautiful about her death. I am glad I'm living in a century when such wonders happen. They make one believe in the reality of things we all play with, such as romance, passion, and love. And there we go. You know, that distinction that I made in the last lecture about if I put love, obsession, and infatuation on the board, what are the differences? Because they're not the same. And here, Harry also kind of divides those things out into three, saying romance, passion, and love, right? That they are three different things as well. And then this is to me is just, this kills it. I mean, with Lord Henry being such a bold character and saying the things that he says, we really appreciate about him that boldness, and we appreciate, it's almost like having someone in the room who just tells it like it is, and you almost feel terrible every time you agree. Well, this is typical Lord Henry. I think this is one of the most, you think the last thing about falling in love with love forever was bad. Listen to this. The girl never really lived, so she never really died. As if she's a character in a novel, as if she is not worth mentioning. And this is what consoles Dorian. This is what consoles him. And so when he looks at the picture first and he finds it to be a visible symbol of the degradation of his own soul because of the sin and the way that he particularly dealt with Sybil, now he finds out she's dead. He feels like he is lacking remorse for some reason. Henry tells him it's completely fine to feel the way that you do and lack remorse because, hey, she never really lived, so she never really died. It's like, what did we really lose here? So now we come back to the end of chapter 8, and this is the kind of the push for Dorian for the rest of the book. He felt that the time had really come for making his choice, or had his choice already been made? Now, this is a really telling thing that Wilde writes about Dorian. Does Dorian make choices, or are choices made for Dorian? Or have you ever met somebody who says, oh, I never had a choice? But yeah, there's always a choice, right? But sometimes we feel like we're pressured into situations. The painting pressured him. No, first Sybil's terrible acting pressured him into his anger to break the engagement. Then the painting pressures him into making amends with Sybil. Then Sybil's death pressures him into this next choice. Dorian is literally like a leaf blowing in the wind, or like a lily pad on the water. It just goes with the ebb and flow. He really has no determining direction in his life up until this point in the book. Yes, life had decided that for him. Life and his own infinite curiosity about life. Eternal youth, infinite passion, pleasures subtle and secret, wild joys, and wilder sins. He was to have all these things. The portrait was to bear the burden of his shame. That was all. So Dorian says, you know what? I was going to sacrifice my freedom and forget all about my friendship with Lord Henry, and I was going to do my duty and marry Sybil and be a good man. But now that's not even an option on the table for me anymore. I am just going to follow that philosophy that Henry talked to me about, where I do not hold myself back from anything that I desire. And look at this list. Imagine if this was on your vision board. Eternal youth. which I guess he can have now because the portrait has captured his soul. So the portrait is now aging. The portrait is now showing the despair of his choices, and Dorian is just simply like the canvas. Infinite passion, infinite and eternal, both are the same thing, right? Infinite means the opposite of finite or ending. Infinite is a passion that never ends. Pleasures, subtle and secret, so sneaky stuff, and wild joys, but even wilder sins. So he was really said, I am going to go crazy. I'm going to live my life now, right? This is just as he comes into his money, so he has the option to do these things without any consequence from his trustees, or the executor of the estate, rather. On the very last image that we have, and you want to look at images, just like we had that image of Sybil Vane on the ground. Images are very important, particularly in poetry, because images tell a lot, right? A picture says 1,000 words. There goes the cliche, right? So we have the image of Sybil Vane on the floor. That kind of foreshadowed her death. Now look at this image. He drew the screen back to its former place in the front of the picture, smiling as he did so. This is Dorian Gray pulling back the screen. He doesn't show anybody this portrait now. This portrait is for him only. Passed into his bedroom, where his valet was already waiting for him. An hour later, he was at the opera, and Lord Henry was leaning over his chair. Now, this image, and I want you to kind of imagine it. Dorian Gray sitting at the opera, and Lord Henry is behind him, leaning over his chair. So you have Dorian sitting, and behind him, the face of Lord Henry, probably with like a hand on the shoulder here. All right? And the hand on the shoulder is always a symbol of domination. It's always a symbol of possession. And so Lord Henry, if you recall from earlier chapters, Lord Henry's agenda was to dominate this son of love and death, as he called Dorian Gray. And in fact, we do have our first instance of love and death in the book. The love of Sybil Vane, the death of Sybil Vane. And this now very bold choice that Dorian has made, or he said that life has made for him, of course, because it's Dorian Gray. He doesn't make any choices on his own, right? Because he doesn't ever want the blame. He doesn't want the responsibility. He shirks blame and responsibility for pleasure and passion and the pursuit of those things. So we're going to see how he continues